How did our beloved country get to such a point? Euthanasia, abortion, embryo and fetal tissue research, perversions galore, including these new fangled so-called marriages, witchcraft, neo-paganism. How have we become such a degenerate people? How did we get to this point? We got here by the destruction of the basic building block of society, and that's the family. This morning, we'll consider two major contributing factors to that destruction. They're painful issues. We don't intend to hurt anyone's feelings. But the two factors that have contributed to the destruction of the family are, first, disastrous misunderstandings about the nature of marriage, and second, disastrous misunderstandings about the nature of the marital act. Let's just take a moment to make sure that we have the correct understanding of these two issues. Marriage is a contract that results in a relationship. If of their own free will, a man and a woman validly make that contract of marriage, then God makes the relationship. They consent to be man and wife, and then God takes them at their word, and He makes them so for life. This relationship is sacramental if both parties are baptized. So just what is the contract that results in marriage? Here's the contract. A man and a woman give and accept an exclusive and perpetual right for acts which are of themselves suitable for the generation of children. That's the marriage contract. This contract is exclusive, forsaking all others. This contract is perpetual until death do us part. This contract is limited. It's limited to acts which are of themselves suitable for the generation of children. And the terms of this contract were determined by God Himself. God created marriage, and He created it with two specific purposes. The primary purpose of marriage is the procreation and education of children. The secondary purpose of marriage is the mutual help and comfort of the spouses and the remedy for concupiscence. The general principle is everything in conformity with those two purposes, the primary and secondary purpose of marriage, is good and permissible. Anything opposed to them is evil and forbidden. That's the background. Now, if that is background, let's turn to the current disaster. We'll start with a misunderstanding about marriage. Now, from the beginning, Protestantism has suffered from serious fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of marriage. Now, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about Luther here. It's not a cheap shot. In part, I'm descended from Lutherans, and a major part of my seminary training was actually paid for by Lutherans. I'm serious. But if we want to see the roots of our current disaster, we simply can't ignore the influence of Martin Luther. So that's where we're going, okay? Number one, according to Luther, marriage is not a sacrament, from which it immediately follows that marriage is an affair of the state and not of the church. In his work entitled The Babylonian Captivity, Martin Luther explicitly denied that marriage is a sacrament. And then in a work called Of God's Word, and I quote, I advise in everything that ministers interfere not in matrimonial questions. First, we have enough to do in our own office. Secondly, because these affairs, questions of marriage, because these affairs concern not the church, but are temporal things pertaining to temporal magistrates. Therefore, we will leave them to the lawyers and magistrates, close quote, Martin Luther. Isn't this precisely the issue that we're dealing with right now in regards to these newfangled so-called marriages? that's become an issue of lawyers and temporal magistrates. There's actually a sort of fearful symmetry in the fact that these first broke out in Massachusetts, because the Pilgrims who landed there believed that marriage was simply a civil contract to be governed by the state and not the church. And now here we are. So that's first. Second, according to Luther, the marriage contract is not necessarily perpetual. In other words, divorce is permissible. Luther has a whole series of reasons for divorce, ranging from adultery to willful desertion to persistent irascibility to serious incompatibility. And incredibly enough, even after the birth of offspring, divorce in his mind is permissible if impotence should subsequently arise. Other grounds, according to Luther, are obstinate refusal to honor the death, and the most unbelievable to me personally, divorce is allowed in the case of one partner coming down with a serious illness. Number 3, according to Luther, the marriage contract is not necessarily exclusive. In other words, in some cases, one does not have to forsake all others. If either party to a marriage can't restrain himself, Luther says, and I quote, "Let him or her woo another in the name of God." Close quote. There's a lot more of this stuff. I won't quote it. It gets worse. On January 27th, 1524, Luther stated, quote, "I admit that I am unable to prohibit a man from marrying several wives. It does not contradict Holy Writ." Close quote. That wasn't just hot air. He really meant that. Quote, "In an opinion on the permissibility of divorcing Catherine of Aragon," that's Henry VIII's legitimate wife, which Luther delivered on September 3rd, 1531, Luther openly and candidly pronounced the marriage of the king to be indissoluble. So his marriage to Catherine is indissoluble. But in order to satisfy the king, pointed out, this is Luther, with the permission of the queen, Henry might, now these are Luther's very own words, Henry might marry an additional queen in conformity with the example of the ancients who had many wives. On August 23rd, Melanchthon, another so-called reformer, also declared in favor of this bigamous opinion, saying, and these are Melanchthon's words, "The king may with a good conscience take a second wife while retaining the first." Close quote. Now we all know that Henry VIII did not take that course of action, although the whole issue at stake was simply a question of marriage and who precisely got to determine the rules. Church lost in that case as well. Henry opted instead for serial polygamy. Just as he tired of one wife, he'd trade her in on a new model. Back to Luther. In December of 1539, Philip of Hesse, Protestant ruler who was well aware of Luther's pronouncement regarding multiple wives, Philip specifically requested a written approval to engage in bigamy by taking another wife in addition to the one he presently had. On December 10th, Luther and Melanchthon replied in writing to Philip, stating, among other things, that this marriage would not be contrary to the laws of God, and therefore could be contracted by Philip because of a necessity of conscience. That's that conscience clause. In a Protestant ceremony on March 4th, 1540, with Luther's written approval and in the very presence of Melanchthon, Philip of Hesse married a second woman while retaining his wife. So in principle, obviously not necessarily in the day-to-day practice of most couples, but in principle from the very beginning, Protestantism has suffered from profound errors about the nature of marriage. And as we all know from the beginning, the United States of America has been a profoundly Protestant country. And so when the divorce tsunami hit, the so-called no-fault divorce laws, when that struck in 1970, spreading out from California to every state except New York by 1985, it hit a population of Protestants that theologically at least had no consistent opposition to the notion of divorce, and at the same time a Catholic population that had been softened by the rebellion against church teaching and the sexual revolution of the 60s. As of 2004, 39% of married Protestants and 25% of married Catholics divorce. The social effect of this has been indescribable. I mean what I'm going to say, but it is doubtful if a full-out nuclear war could have wreaked as much havoc in our beloved country. In 1880, Pope Leo XIII